Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to have me with you for this conference, which is a conference on biological and psychological studies. I am not a psychologist. I am particularly interested in questions of the environment, environmental change, and the politics thereof. What I would like to do this afternoon with you is to take a psychoanalytic perspective on the current climate change situation. The title of my talk is "The Apocalypse is Disappointing, Enjoying Climate Change and the Deadlock of the Climate Consensus." The starting point of my talk is a quote from the Russian theorist Chukovsky, who said a few years ago, "Critical knowledge does not self-evidently translate into transformative action, as such action is trumped by libidinal investment in sustaining the fundamental configuration of the present capitalist socio-ecological order." So what I really want to address is the following conundrum, or paradox, which can be summarized as follows. We do know the truth of climate change. There is overwhelming scientific evidence of how climate change works and the consequences of rapid climate change on social and ecological parameters on Earth. Nonetheless, despite the fact that we know the science and the truth of climate change, we continue to act as if we do not know. There's in other words, what psychologists would call a psychological dissonance between knowing the truth of the situation and acting according to that knowledge. And it's precisely that paradox or that conundrum that I would like to explore by focusing on the Lacanian psychoanalytic notion of enjoyment. So I am going to explore enjoyment, what Lacan called jouissance, as a political factor. I shall try to speak a bit louder. Let me know if you can't hear me very well. There are four themes I would like to explore. First of all, I will say something about what I call the climate deadlock. The climate deadlock, which is, as I just said, is the dissonance between the facts of climate change that we know and the absence of appropriate acting. It's a form of what Octavio Manoni called fetishistic disavowal. Je sais bien, mais quand même. I know very well the truth of the situation, but nonetheless, I act as if I do not know. In order to explore that and account for that deadlock, I'm going to consider the question of enjoyment as a political factor. To then move on to consider how, in a variety of ways, from a range of different positions, we actually enjoy climate change. To conclude by by making a case for the need to traverse the fantasy around which the climate change argument is constituted in order to move towards what I would call a real enjoyment of climate change. So first of all, the starting point of my argument is that despite the fact that there is a quasi-global consensus about the truth of climate change, nothing is really happening other than major arguments, disputes, international meetings like the COP meetings, etc. Consider, for example, that since 1990, greenhouse gas emissions increased by more than 70%. That's on average a 2% increase every year. It's an increase in greenhouse gas emissions that is more or less in line with the economic accumulation process, with the economic growth process. So is that what I mean by the climate deadlock? Despite the fact we know those facts of climate change, we act as if we do not know. And there is therefore a form of psychological dissonance, or what psychoanalysts call fetishistic disavowal, between knowing the facts and acting accordingly. So there is indeed a rational, conscious recognition of the truth of climate change, but that conscious recognition is disavowed in the act. This disavowal does not imply a full negation of climate change, but there's a continuous struggle between conscious recognition and unconscious denial. So the key conundrum or issue we need to address, of course, is why does nothing really change? The fact, despite the fact that we know that things have to change. And I would argue that the psychoanalytical concept of jouissance, of enjoyment as a political factor, might help to account for that deadlock. The overall argument that I'm trying to make is that the climate and its change is not only a threat to the world, which it is, but it is also something that is enjoyed in one way or the other. So let me say something about enjoyment as a political factor. How can or should we understand the Lacanian psychoanalytic notion of jouissance, of enjoyment? Jouissance, enjoyment, is predicated upon a lack, a gap, or absence to be covered, a hole to be plugged. And Lacanian psychoanalysis locates the origin of this lack. So enjoyment is the attempt to get something that one does not have. For Lacan, the process of subjectivation, becoming subject, entails a constitutive loss of jouissance. After entering the symbolic order, which equals for Jacques Lacan the moment of becoming a subject je proper, the subject is marked by symbolic castration, deprived of its subject, of its substance. The subject, the individual, by entering the symbolic order, by entering language, retroactively inaugurates a gap, a hole, a void, an unsymbolizable sticky thing that defines the subject. So enjoyment then emerges as the forever failing attempt to fill out the gap, to plug the hole, to become whole again. And it's precisely that that will drive the subject forward. It's what Lacan, after Freud, called the death drive. Enjoyment, therefore, in contrast to pleasure, is this insatiable and always failing attempt to secure the void opened up by symbolic castration. The void that structures the subject's psychic apparatus of pursuing enjoyment in turn becomes stained with the spectral presence, which Lacan denotes as the object cause of desire, or object A. This object cause of desire allows the subject to give body to the lack of enjoyment that perpetuates its existence. Object A is this phantasmagorical little thing that sets desires into motion and promises fulfillment, but ultimately never really satisfies fully. It's like when you're thirsty, you say, oh, Coca-Cola is it. That will satisfy my thirst, but will ultimately always fail. Desire is thus the other pole of enjoyment, as Lacan puts it. While the latter, the enjoyment, emerges out of a gap, a void, a nothingness, the former, object A, circulates around a real or imaginary thing that becomes the stand-in for the all of enjoyment, and that animates the subject in the pursuit of a little or partial satisfaction, one that is never fully really it. In the argument I'm going to develop here, CO2, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases operate as such an object A. Isn't it the case that the overall climate change argument is that we have to eliminate, manage greenhouse gases so that we can produce again a wholesome, inclusive, and ecologically sensible Earth? As Jody Dean puts it, enjoyment refers to an excessive pleasure and pain, to that something extra that twists your pleasure into a fascinating, even unbearable intensity. It's a special kind of agony, an agony that makes us feel more alive, more fully present, more in tune with what makes life worth living and dying for than anything else. Enjoyment then is this extra, this excess beyond the given, the measurable, the rational, and the useful. It is that something extra for the sake of which we do something what might otherwise be seen as irrational, counterproductive, and even wrong. The presumed qualities of an object, and think of your greenhouse gases or CO2, to finally complete the subject, do not originate from the object itself, but from the subject's fantasy. These variegated fantasies are closely associated with the position of the subject in the social bond. So in the climate change argument, the key fantasy is that climate change action will produce a wholesome, a just, and an ecologically better world. Today, for example, in Brussels, there are 30,000 climate activists marching through the streets of Brussels to demand climate change action, and they are thoroughly enjoying their activism. So what I want to move on to now is to consider this notion of enjoying the climate change. And I will consider two forms, two ways in which climate change is being enjoyed. On the one hand, the superego injunction to enjoy, on the one hand, versus the imaginary enjoyment of climate change action. So we argue that the knowledge or the truth about the climate becomes infused by a set of fantasies and discourses that circle around a particular object cause of desire. And that obscures what shapes the climate situation. That is ultimately the process of insatiable economic growth and capital accumulation. We do know that that drives the climate dynamics, but that is obscured. And in doing so, it keeps the environmental gaze circulating around the fetishized thing so that nothing really has to change. That is, rather than tackling the real underlying systemic causes of climate change, much of the climate change argument gets displaced to focus around this fetishized thing called CO2 or other greenhouse gases. We will differentiate between two dominant strands of enjoyment related to climate change. First, on the one hand, we will consider the passionate engagement in destroying nature, one pursued by climate change skeptics, which is based on an imperative to enjoy fossil fuels and what they metonymically stand for. And second, we will consider the position of the climate activist, which also embodies an equally passionate commitment to saving nature based on an imaginary enjoyment that stems from renunciation and sacrifice. We shall conclude by arguing for the need to traverse the fantasies that sustain the very deadlock of the current situation. A process that requires rescripting the process of political subjectivation and our libidinal attachment to the enjoyment of the climate and its change. An anamorphic gaze at the climate situation, one that transgresses the fantasy, structured through organizing desire from the vantage point of the climate directly, may offer a different mode of organizing the way we enjoy climate change. So first of all, let us consider the superego injunction to enjoy the climate change. Is the enjoyment found among the climate skeptics? Consider, for example, Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin was the vice presidential candidate for the presidential US elections in 2008. And in her debate with the then Democratic vice presidential candidate, Joe Biden, who would be vice president under Obama, Sarah Palin used this slogan, "Drill, baby, drill." And she was, of course, demanding and advocating the further drilling of oil in the United States, and in particular in her home state of Alaska. Now, in the slogan, "Drill, baby, drill," in fact, the same slogan was 1 year later used by Penthouse Movies to do a soft porn movie with that title. It's indeed difficult to ignore the libidinal attachment inscribed in this slogan, "Drill, baby, drill." Not just the overtly sexualized meaning and erotic excess of the slogan strikes. As I said, Penthouse Corporation made a soft porn flick with the same title next year. Sarah Palin also expresses with this slogan a deeper satisfaction with the continuing destruction of the planet, as well as with transgressing the dominant scientific and broad political consensus about the challenges and dangers posed by accelerating anthropogenic climate change. And this is, of course, jouissance at its best, an excessive, painful, often self-destructing, yet exhilarating and norm-transgressing deep pleasure. And the same can be found in some of the statements by Donald Trump, when Trump said, "Trump digs coal." Or it can be found, of course, in the boom of SUV cars that are bought by particularly white American and other suburban middle classes. The SUV boom indeed again illustrates the libidinal enjoyment that is attached to transgressing the master discourse of climate change, a deep enjoyment in transgressing the consensual norm that climate change matters and that something should be done about it. It's a superego injunction to actually enjoy the climate change. The second one, and probably from our perspective, the more interesting one, is the imaginary enjoyment of environmental political action. That is the enjoyment mobilized and expressed by many, not all, but by many climate activists. That is those who do take the climate seriously and who do act in order to address the problem of climate change through addressing the question of greenhouse gases. From Al Gore to Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion, they all yet proffer the enjoyment of sacrifice as a way out of our climate pickle. Akin to the sacrificial pleasure that promises ultimate enjoyment in some future wholesome Arcadia, Sacrificial practices seemingly paved the road to a wholesome, socially just, and ecologically more sensible environment. Denouncing excessive consumption, promoting vliegskam, flight shame, you shouldn't fly because it's bad for the environment, and reducing automobility as moralizing deploys. Vegetarianism, recycling, Green New Deals, and the anxiety-ridden, if not depression-inducing loop of the always insufficient asceticism to make the earth and its climate wholesome again. They do indicate, all these actions indicate a libidinal attachment to sacrifice as a road to fullness. So a deep, excessive, and actually disturbing enjoyment lurks underneath the consciously symbolized concern with the earth and the future of earthlings, as many environmental activists enjoy restricting activities, preach the pleasures of austerity and renunciation, and embrace a generalized ascetic life in order to save the earth. In doing so, they transgress the injunction to enjoy that nurtures the superego demand that we just talked about. The climate enjoyment as sacrifice dwells in the fantasy of recuperating assumedly once upon a time wholesome climate, one that excessive consumption has derailed. But that loss, that assumedly lost climate can be regained, can be reconstituted with the right sacrificial pursuit. What imaginary enjoyment refers to is a change of habits and lifestyles as a response to climate change, but without changing the socio-symbolic order that leads to climate change in the first place. This is the cultural expression of the neoliberal injunction to enjoy individual freedom. In doing so, imaginary enjoyment transgresses the injunction to enjoy fossil fuels by establishing a fantasy of recuperating a once wholesome climate that excessive consumption based on fossil fuels has derailed, but whose loss can presumably be regained with the right individual sacrificial pursuit. So the loss of enjoyment, it is as if enjoyment has been stolen. And this comes from the classic Žižekian interpretation of the loss of enjoyment that is stolen by an other whose very enjoyment stands as the fulcrum of what is presumably lost. Consider, for example, Greta Thunberg, the climate activist, who exclaimed a few years ago to the assembled United Nations leaders, "You have stolen my dreams." Here too, enjoyment is associated with an unfulfillable, satisfying end, and with a deep pleasure propelled by transgressing the hegemonic ways of speaking and acting. Thunberg reactivates a sense of loss that is a common motif in environmental activism today. The world prior to climate change, or even nature more generally, is posited as something which provided us once upon a time with a sense of wholeness and completeness, and which now is allegedly lost. Enjoying sacrificial constraint now to achieve full satisfaction later is also strangely akin to the sacrifices enjoined by the infernal loop of incessant capitalist consumption, driven too by the urge to get satisfaction from the next product on the shelf, just to experience that further sacrifice is required as the failure of each new product to instill full and final satisfaction incites our rush for the next. as Jody Dean maintains, enjoying climate change unfolds in Manichean parallel to the circuits of enjoyment that fuels the drive for accumulation. As Todd McGowan puts it, imaginary enjoyment, that is the enjoyment that I just talked about, the one expressed by many climate activists, allows the subject to remain securely rooted in its symbolic identity. It respects symbolic barriers, even as it offers the subject the illusion of transgressing them, which is why it doesn't threaten the stability of the symbolic order. That's why much of the actually existing climate activism is utterly and completely ineffective. In our society of commanded enjoyment, everything is permitted, including climate action, provided it is not dangerous or really transgressive, as long as it keeps the existing socio-ecological order intact. It's a form of decaffeinated climate action that is enjoyed. It's like beer without alcohol, sugar-free Coke, or eco-friendly Starbucks coffee. What we experience as climate change, reality, discloses itself against the background of the lack, of the absence, of the thing, of the mythical object whose encounter would bring about the full satisfaction, Slavoj Žižek insists. The thing relates to the natural world before the climate crisis, a world that is presumably lost and at the same time linked to an unattainable enjoyment. However, since the world is considered as not only lost, but stolen from us, it also means that it might be hope for recovering this world and restoring complete enjoyment if we can just restore the climate as it once was. This is the ultimate fantasy underlying the imaginary enjoyment inherent in climate change action. So what needs to be done, therefore, is transgress the fantasy. And that is, and to really enjoy climate change. Or in other words, we have to move from a politics of enjoyment to enjoying politics. I'm going to conclude with making 5 points here of the kinds of transgression of fantasy that is required if we wish to consider a more effective, a more workable, effective climate politics. We have to move away from considering greenhouse gases as the object cause of the problematic. We have to recognize it as what it is, that is a fetishistic displacement. We have to move from a desire that is articulated around the little thing, CO2, to enjoying the impossible thing. That is to enjoy the need for full socio-ecological system change. Secondly, I think we have to move away from the fantasy of a dystopian climate future. As you know, most of the climate change argument and the legitimation of climate action is based on portraying a dystopian climate future. But this dystopian climate future will never come for some. What we need to do, therefore, is to fully recognize and embrace the really existing, already existing, combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe. The climate change is not a catastrophe to come for all. It is already an existing catastrophe for many in the present time, but not for all. It is from within the ruins of the existing socio-ecological collapse, that a new politics might arise. We also have to abandon the fantasy of a presumably lost Arcadia. The view, the fantasy that once upon a time nature was wholesome and sustainable, and that we can recover this sustainable nature, that we can recover an idyllic socio-natural harmony that can be made. That has to be abandoned radically. As Alain Badiou argued, we really have to consider that today, very often, ecology operates as the new opium of the people, scandalously using Karl Marx's old dictum that religion is the opium of the people. Alain Badiou argues that today ecology functions as the opium for the people. What needs to be recognized is that there is no wholesome nature to return to or to regain. In fact, nature does not care. Fourthly, we have to abandon the fantasy, another fantasy upon which much of the climate change action is based, the fantasy of a presumably existing humanity, a global humanity that is under threat as a result of ecological change and climate change, and that therefore needs salvation, requires salvation. I think that has to be replaced by recognizing the reality that humanity has never existed. What needs to be done, therefore, is not sustaining a presumably lost humanity from the past, which has never existed to begin with, but to embrace enjoying, creating a humanity as the only possible trajectory of the future. And that is, of course, a political procedure. The creation of a global humanity moves away from a politics of enjoyment to really enjoying politics. That is the process through which a humanity is being carved out. And finally, we have to recognize that the people do not exist. The people in whose name climate change action is legitimized, that the people as a political category does not exist. We have to fully avow, fully recognize the splits, the gaps, the holes, the inconsistencies, the unequal power relationships within the existing socio-ecological order. We have to learn to enjoy making a people as a political category and encircling the real of social and economic class struggle and antagonism as the key procedure in fighting politically for a different, for a new, and for the socio-ecologically more humane ordering. Okay, I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much indeed.